If you want to become an editor or understand the film that you watch regularly, layer by layer, then this book.
It would be in the blink of an eye.
Walter Murch is one of the most respected film editors of all time.
In the blink of an eye.
And his book, In the Blink of an Eye,
Is in the blink of an eye.
I know you are intelligent enough to listen to this audiobook to enrich your intelligence much more. Misdirection. Underlying these considerations is the central preoccupation of a film editor, which should be to put himself/herself in place of the audience. What is the audience going to be thinking at any particular moment? Where are they going to be looking? What do you want them to think about? What do they need to think about? And, of course, what do you want them to feel? If you keep this in mind, and it's the preoccupation of every magician, then you are a kind of magician, not in the supernatural sense, just an everyday working magician. Houdini's job was to create a sense of wonder. And to do that, he didn't want you to look here, to the right, because that's where he was undoing his chains. So he found a way to make you look there, to the left. He was misdirecting you, as magicians say. He was doing something that would cause 99% of you to look over here when he wanted you to. And an editor can do that, and does do that, and should do that. Sometimes, though, you can get caught up in the details and lose track of the overview. When that happens to me, it is usually because I've been looking at the image as the miniature it is in the editing room, rather than seeing it as the mural that it will become when projected in a theater. Something that will quickly restore the correct perspective is to imagine yourself very small and the screen very large, and pretend that you are watching the finished film in a 1,000-seat theater filled with people, and that the film is beyond the possibility of any further changes. If you still like what you see, it is probably okay. If not, you will now most likely have a better idea of how to correct the problem, whatever it is. One of the tricks I use to help me achieve this perspective is to cut out little paper dolls, a man and a woman, and put one on each side of the editing screen. The size of the dolls, a few inches high, is proportionately correct to make the screen seem as if it is 30 feet wide. Seeing around the urge of the frame. The film editor is one of the few people working on the production of a film who does not know the exact conditions under which it was shot, or has the ability not to know, and who can at the same time have a tremendous influence on the film. If you have been on and around the set most of the time, as the actors, the producer, director, cameraman, art director, etc. have been, you can get caught up in the sometimes bloody practicalities of gestation and delivery, and then when you see the dailies, you can't help in your mind's eye seeing around the edge of the frame. You can imagine everything that was there, physically and emotionally, just beyond what was actually photographed. We worked like hell to get that shot. It has to be in the film. You, the director in this case, are convinced that what you got was what you wanted. But there's a possibility that you may be forcing yourself to see it that way because it costs so much in money, time, angst to get it. By the same token, there are occasions when you shoot something that you dislike, when everyone is in a bad mood, and you say under protest, all right, I'll do this, we'll get this one close up, and then it's a wrap. Later on, when you look at that take, all you can remember was the hateful moment it was shot, and so you may be blind to the potentials it might have in a different context. The editor, on the other hand, should try to see only what's on the screen, as the audience will. Only in this way can the images be freed from the context of their creation. By focusing on the screen, the editor will hopefully use the moments that should be used, even if they may have been shot under duress, and reject moments that should be rejected, even though they cost a terrible amount of money and pain. I guess I'm urging the preservation of a certain kind of virginity. Don't unnecessarily allow yourself to be impregnated by the conditions of shooting. Try to keep up with what's going on, but try to have as little specific knowledge of it as possible, because ultimately the audience knows nothing about any of this, and you are the ombudsman for the audience. Director, of course, is the person most familiar with all of the things that went on during the shoot. So he is the most burdened with this surplus beyond the frame information. Between the end of shooting and before the first cut is finished, the The very best thing that can happen to the director and the film is that he say goodbye to everyone and disappear for 2 weeks, up to the mountains or down to the sea or out to Mars or somewhere, and try to discharge this surplus. Wherever he goes, he should try to think as much as possible about things that have absolutely nothing to do with the film. It is difficult, but it is necessary to create a barrier, a cellular wall between shooting and editing. Fred Zinnemann would go climbing in the Alps after the end of shooting, just to put himself in a potentially life-threatening situation where he had to be there, not daydreaming about the film's problems. Then, after a few weeks, he would come down from the Alps back to Earth. He would sit down in a dark room alone, the arc light would ignite, and he would watch his film. He would still be, inherently, brimming with those images from beyond the edge of the frame. A director will never be fully able to forget them. But if he had gone straight from shooting to editing, the confusion would be worse, and he would have gotten the two different thought processes of shooting and editing irrevocably mixed up. Do everything you can to help the director erect this barrier for himself so that when he first sees the film, he can say, all right, I'm going to pretend that I had nothing to do with this film. It needs some work. What needs to be done? And so you try as hard as you can to separate out what you wish from what is actually there, never abandoning your ultimate dreams for the film, but trying as hard as you can to see what is actually on the screen. Dreaming in pairs. In many ways, the film editor performs the same role for the director as the text editor does for the writer of a book, to encourage certain courses of action, to counsel against others, to discuss whether to include specific material in the finished work or whether new material needs to be added. At the end of the day, though, it is the writer who then goes off and puts the words together. But in film, the editor also has the responsibility for actually assembling the images, that is to say, the words in a certain order and in a certain rhythm. And here it becomes the director's role to offer advice and counsel, much as he would to an actor interpreting a part. So it seems that the film editor-director relationship oscillates back and forth during the course of the project, the numerator becoming the denominator and vice versa. In dream therapy, there is a technique that pairs the patient, the dreamer, in this case, with someone who is there to listen to the dream. As soon as possible after waking, the dreamer gets together with his listener to review the dreams of the previous night. Frequently, there is nothing, or just a single disappointing image, but this is usually enough to begin the process. Once the image is described, the listener's job is to propose an imaginary sequence of events based on that fragment. An airplane, for instance, is all that is remembered. The listener immediately proposes that it must have been an airliner flying over Tahiti, filled with golf balls for a tournament in Indonesia. No sooner has this description been offered than the dreamer finds himself protesting. No, it was a biplane flying over the battlefields of France, and Hannibal was shooting arrows at it from his legion of elephants. In other words, the dream itself, hidden in the memory, rises to its own defense when it hears itself being challenged by an alternate version, and so reveals itself. This revelation about biplanes and elephants can in turn prompt the listener to elaborate another improvisation, which will coax out another aspect of the hidden dream, and so on, until as much of the dream is revealed as possible. The relationship between director and editor is somewhat similar in that the director is generally the dreamer and the editor is the listener. But even for the most well-prepared of directors, there are limits to the imagination and memory, particularly at the level of fine detail. And so it is the editor's job to propose alternate scenarios as bait to encourage the sleeping dream to rise to its defense and thus reveal itself more fully. And these scenarios unfold themselves at the largest level should such and such a scene be removed from the film for the good of the whole, and at the most detailed, should this shot end on this frame or else 24th of a second later on the next frame. But sometimes it is the editor who is the dreamer and the director who is the listener, and it is he who now offers the bait to tempt the collective dream to reveal more of itself. As any fisherman can tell you, it is the quality of the bait that determines the kind of fish you catch. Teamwork. multiple editors. A lot only does the editor collaborate with the director. There are frequent times when 2 or more editors are working simultaneously, sometimes with equal authority. This seems odd to many people who do not see the same thing happening with directors of photography or production designers. But for some reason, which has to do with the collaborative mentality of editors and with the fact that the time pressure of post-production is not quite so unforgiving in its consequences as it is during production, multiple editors are often employed. I have worked and enjoyed collaborating with other editors on many films: The Conversation, Apocalypse Now, The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and Godfather Part 3. The main advantage to collaborative editing is speed. The main risk is lack of coherence. But if there are upward of 350,000 feet of work print, 65 hours, you're probably going to need to take that risk and have 2 editors, or at least an associate editor working under supervision. But problems can sometimes arise if there is just one editor on a film and he develops a locked viewpoint about the material. This is particularly troublesome if the director and the editor have not worked together before and have no time to develop a common language. In this case, it might not be a bad idea to consider having multiple editors. The Godfather was the first film on which Francis worked with 2 editors. Originally, there had been just a single editor, but the problem of locked viewpoint became acute, and he was let go after several months. The decision was made to reconstitute what had been done up to that point and start again, but because they had effectively lost those months, and it looked as though the film was going to be almost 3 hours long with an inflexible deadline, it made sense to hire 2 editors. The film was still shooting, and there was just a lot of work to do. Each editor had a 90-minute film to complete in 24 weeks. But unlike the later Godfather Part 2 or Apocalypse, the work was split strictly in half. Bill Reynolds cut the first part, and Peter Zinner cut the last part. There's a specific point where Bill's section ends and Peter's begins. On Godfather Part 2, although the responsibility for editing was divided up in a checkerboard pattern, scenes were initially cut and recut by the same person. But when Francis began to play with the structure of the film, people found themselves recutting what others had originally edited. The interest on a $25 million film is around $250,000 a month. If having 2 editors can help you release that film a month earlier, they will have repaid a good portion, if not all, of their salaries for the whole film. It is simply a matter of how much you want to achieve in the time you have available. If you end up with a cut per day rate of 1.47, as we did on Apocalypse, that means that many different avenues have been explored to get to the final product. And if that's what you want to do, you probably need more than one editor. The decisive moment. While Phil Kaufman was shooting the Unbearable Lightness of Being in France, I was editing it in Berkeley, California, 6,000 miles away. The dailies would be shipped approximately every 2 weeks, and I would then sit and watch 10 hours or so of film, taking notes, making sure it was in sync, getting ready to code it, etc. But in addition to the usual procedures, I also would select at least one representative frame from every setup, camera position, and take a still photograph of it off the work print. We then had these photos developed and printed at the local 1-hour place, like Family Snapshots, and they were put onto panels arranged according to scene. Whenever a setup had complex staging or a moving camera, it was necessary to take more than one photo. I think the most that I ever took for Unbearable was 7, which was for a very complicated party scene. Usually it was 3, and most of the time it was just 1. We had to use a special reproducing negative to make these pictures, since on ordinary snapshot, negative produces too much contrast. The speed of the film is low, about ASA 2 or something, so the time exposure has to be quite long, but it worked out well. The photos were actually pretty close approximations of the real color balance and contrast ratio of the film. The photographs are a great help in later discussions with the director about what was shot and how it was shot. They resolve those kinds of discussions very quickly. They also provide a record of some details beyond the ability of even the best continuity person. The particulars of an actor's hairline, or a little peculiarity of costume, the way the collar flips up or down, or how rosy somebody's complexion was. or whether their hat left a mark on their forehead when they took it off, those kinds of things. They are also a great resource for the publicity department or anyone else coming onto the film at a later date. You can instantly see and cross-reference characters in all kinds of different emotional states, as well as the photography, the costumes, and the scenery. Also, just because of the way they were displayed, the pictures tended to collide against each other in interesting ways. On Unbearable, we had perhaps 16 panels of photos, 130 photos to a panel, and each panel was laid out like a page of a book. You read the photos from left to right and then down a row, left to right again, etc., just like reading text. And when you got to the bottom of one panel, you went up to the top of the next and read across the first line, etc. So the juncture between those panels was an interesting thing to look at because it juxtaposed frames that were never meant to go together, and yet there they were, right next to each other. And sometimes you got sparks out of that. It would cause you to think about things, editorial leaps that otherwise you might never have thought of without this system. In the blink of an eye, 2 frames of Teresa, played by Juliette Binoche from The Unbearable Lightness of Being. The 3-digit numbers in the lower left-hand corner of each picture, 620, 296, refer to the setup number of the shot from which the frame was taken. And the number 2.2 in the adjacent rectangle of 620 identifies that frame as occupying a certain place in the sequence. Frame 2 in a series of 2. 56 in the blink of an eye, 2 frames of Sabina, played by Lena Olin from The Unbearable Lightness of Being. The numbering system here is the same as for Teresa's photos on the previous pages. Both these frames come from the impromptu photo session between Sabina and Teresa. 2 frames of Teresa from The Unbearable Lightness of Being. In the case of 5542, 1 frame was sufficient to give a complete idea of the setup. Number 635, however, required 3 photos, of which this is number 2, because of the complex nature of the shot. This comes from the same scene as number 634 of Sabina, and the 2 shots were cut together in the finished film. But the most interesting asset of the photos for me was that they provided the hieroglyphs for a language of emotions. What word expresses the concept of ironic anger tinged with melancholy? There isn't a word for it in English anyway, but you can see that specific emotion represented in this photograph. Or the photo may represent a kind of nervous anticipation. The character is scared and lustful at the same time, and yet she is confused because that lust is for another woman, and that woman is sleeping with her husband. So what does that mean? Whatever it means, it is there in her expression, in the angle of her head and her hair and her neck, and the tension in the muscles and the set of her mouth and what is in her eyes. And if you can simply point to an expression on an actor's face, you have a way around some of the difficulties of language in dealing with the subtleties of nameless emotions. You, as the director, can say, that's what I want. The sequence we are working on should have more of that, you know. I want it to embody the nameless but familiar emotion I see in that photograph. The editor's job now is to choose the right images and make those images follow one another at the right rate to express something like what is captured in that photograph. In choosing a representative frame, what you're looking for is an image that distills the essence of the thousands of frames that make up the shot in question, what Cartier-Bresson, referring to still photography, called the decisive moment. So I think more often than not, the image that I chose wound up in the film, and also more often than not, quite close to the cut point. When you look at dailies, there's a pitfall similar to the one that you may fall into during casting sessions. For the actor who is walking through the door, this casting session is the one and only time that he is going to present him or herself to you. This is a tremendously important moment for him, but for you, this may be the 60th person you've seen that day. Inevitably, there is a kind of mental glaze that may form after a while that stops you thinking as sharply as you should. Well, dailies are like that too. Each shot is auditioning for your approval. Take 5. How about me? I can do this. Then take 7. Comes in the door. How about this? Take 9. Or this. And to keep your awareness to really be alive to the possibilities in each shot, you have to keep jabbing yourself. You try to remain fresh and see the wonderful things and make records of those, as well as the things that may not be so wonderful, which is what you have to do when you're casting a film. But if you have to choose a representative set of stills from every setup, you will automatically start thinking differently. You have to be analytical right from the beginning, which is what you should be when you are looking at dailies. But everyone being human and dailies sometimes going on as long as they do, we sometimes tend to just sit there and let the dailies roll over us. What this photo system does is just tip you up out of your chair a bit. It's an encouragement to do what you should be doing anyway. And it is the beginning of the editorial process. You are already beginning to edit at the point that you say, I like this frame rather than that frame.